Planning Commission here tonight as well. So I appreciate everybody attending this evening. So we're going to kick this off with a little presentation by Laurie Anderson, who's the principal planner here. She's going to kind of give you some background about what is middle missing housing to kind of set that framework for the panel discussion. She will introduce the panel members and the moderator, and then we will turn it over to the moderator to begin the panel discussion. There are several questions that the panel will be answering, and following the panel discussion, there will be an opportunity for public questions. So thank you.
Good evening. I'll echo Debbie's welcome and say that these folks are so impressive that I'm going to have to read their biographies. It's not a one-sentence situation. So let me introduce the panel, and then I'm going to follow up with some pictures of missing middle housing so we're all knowing what we're talking about here this evening. I'm going to start with Matt Hutchins here. He's a founder of Cast Architecture, and he spent more than 20 years working to increase the vitality of the city and protect the environment. Through his design and policy work, Matt is an advocate for better density, abundant housing options, vibrant urban spaces, open space, and sustainable building. He serves on AIA, that's the American Institute of Architects, Seattle's Housing Task Force, Public Policy Board, and Housing Design Forum, and the Southwest Design Review Board. He co-founded the community group, MOAR, or MORE, for more options for accessory residences to support zoning reform for accessory dwellings. Linda Pruett, our next panelist, is a nationally recognized and award-winning real estate developer and builder. Linda Pruett is a leading expert on building infill communities of compact, single-family homes that encourage neighborly connections and embrace sustainability. Linda also consults with residential developers nationwide who seek to create pocket neighborhood communities, cottage housing of innovative medium-density infill development in their region. Linda co-founded the Cottage Company in 1996 and has completed 9 communities in the Pacific Northwest, including communities in Kirkland and in Shoreline. Her communities have earned multiple regional and national awards and have been profiled by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Sunset Magazine, among other publications. So our next panelist is a familiar face, Eric Campbell. Eric is the Chief Executive Officer of Main Street Property Group and GenCap Construction Company, leading real estate development and construction management firms dedicated to the vision, construction, and operation of landmark properties throughout the Puget Sound region, including in Kenmore's own award-winning downtown. As the former owner and president of CamWest Development, Eric developed a demonstration cottage housing project in Kirkland, and his affordable housing community in Woodinville, the Greenbrier Heights, included cottage housing and was honored with the Governor's Legacy of Livable Communities Award and a 2006 Vision 2020 Award. Eric currently serves on the advisory board at UW's Runstad Center and the Center for Real Estate Research. Rick Moeller, down toward the other end of the table, is a licensed architect and an associate professor of architecture at the UW. In 1991, he co-founded Adams Moeller Architects, now Moeller and Galino Architects, a firm engaged in both residential and commercial projects. His own house, an accessory dwelling unit, the Flip Flop House, was recognized with multiple Seattle AIA awards and named one of the top 10 innovative houses of 2010 by Builder Magazine. Rick is a member of the Seattle Planning Commission and Seattle's ADU Working Group, and he co-chairs the AIA Seattle Public Policy Board and was a 2015 affiliate fellow of the UW Runstad Center for Real Estate Studies. He served as founding co-chair of the AIA Seattle Future Shack program, which recognizes innovative housing solutions, and is a founding member of the housing advocacy group Welcoming Wallingford. And at the far end of the table, John Owen. John is an architect and a partner in the award-winning architectural and urban design firm Makers. John's work is focused on urban design, and he has become increasingly involved in regional and statewide issues, including working with the Puget Sound Regional Council in the development of regional urban design strategies. John was one of the authors of an innovative accessory innovative pilot program for the city of Tacoma, and he's going to speak to that specifically tonight. The program considered detached accessory dwelling units, duplexes, and cottage housing, among other development types, in single-family residential neighborhoods with the intent to promote innovative infill that demonstrated high-quality building and neighborhood compatibility. And our moderator, Lindsay Masters, there in the middle, is Arch's new executive manager. So Lindsay has spent her career working in affordable housing and community development in Chicago and in Seattle. After graduating from Dartmouth College, she began working on housing policy and advocacy at the federal, state, and local levels. After a move to Seattle, Lindsay joined the public sector and deepened her expertise in affordable housing finance, real estate development, and multifamily lending, working as a strategic advisor for housing policy with the city of Seattle. And she's been the executive manager of Arch for the past year. So, what is missing middle housing? This is a term that was coined by an architect, Dan Perolick, a California architect, when he was talking about every housing type ranging between duplexes up to courtyard housing, cottage housing, etc. And he coined that term because these are housing types that were very predominant in history, in the history of this country, and that have all but disappeared in current new construction. And why did they disappear? Well, some would say that it's zoning restrictions that either prevent them or prohibit them outright. So today's panelists have experience with all types of missing middle housing, and we've invited them here to offer their expertise on why this housing is important and what makes it feasible. And I'm going to show you a few images, some of them from our panelists, actually, of missing middle housing. To put it in context, these are historic duplexes. So, again, this is a historical building type. If you look at the houses on the left and the house at the bottom, you can see the two doors entering into the units. And so a duplex, they're attached two-unit properties. The one on the upper right, you can't see the doors, but you can clearly see that it would be feasible that there are two units there. I'm next going to show you some contemporary duplexes, one in Vancouver Island and one in Denver. So again, in form, they look very much like detached single-family residences, but these are duplexes. And then the last photo of this housing type I want to show you is one done by our panelist, Matt Hutchins. This is a drawing of a potential duplex that might fit well into a neighborhood. The next housing type I want to talk about is cottage housing. So this is historic cottage housing. These are the Pine Street cottages in Seattle. They were built in 1915 and renovated in 1991. They're small houses, and cottage housing is usually maybe 800 to 1,000, maybe a little bit more. Our panelists can speak to that more knowledgeably than I can. But we have two persons on our panel who have done cottage housing. Again, Linda Pruett with the Cottage Company. This is one of her developments. I believe this is the Shoreline development. And then the next one I want to show you is a demonstration project by Eric Campbell. This one is in Kirkland. So, everything okay?
No, we're just taking this. This one is one of the best portfolio projects.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Oh, City of Kirkland.
You can tell by because she put an extra $100,000 in this.
Oh, I see. Well, City of Kirkland has this as Eric's project. All right, so accessory dwelling units. Accessory dwelling units are small cottages that might sit behind a primary residence, or maybe it's a living space over a garage. These are actually living spaces over carriage houses. So you can see clearly that these were an historic housing type. That one on the right is a really old photo from the Denny Blaine neighborhood in Seattle. So contemporary, contemporary ADUs. Here are 4 pictures. 2 of them are by cast architecture. Maybe 3 of them are by cast architecture. All 3. And then in the middle, you can see the example with the dashed line where they have the living unit, much as those carriage houses over the garage. And the last slide I wanted to show you is one done by panelist Rick Molino. This is Rick Moeller, pardon me. This is the flip-flop house, the one I mentioned when I introduced Rick. So with that, I will turn it over to Lindsay to ask our panelists some questions.
Can everybody hear me all right? Great. Well, I want to say a big thank you to Lori for putting this together. I'm really honored to be here amongst these fine experts. This has been a huge topic of interest, not just in Kenmore, but in a number of other cities that are in Arch's membership. And so we're really excited that there's this opportunity to bring this discussion and some of this expertise for the whole region to benefit from. So I'm going to start with a pretty general open question that I'd like all the panelists to speak to, and that's just to tell us a little bit more about your background, what you bring to this conversation, your interest in missing middle housing, what defines missing middle housing type in your mind, and why this type of housing is important today. And I'll start down at the end with Matt.
Hi, how's everybody doing tonight? All right, cool. Let's see. So I first got my practice has always been about houses, but I really got involved in thinking about kind of, not necessarily missing middle, but also just the future of how we live on this planet when my daughter was born. And I started thinking about well, I've got to do a lot more to protect this planet. I have to do a lot more to figure out where she's going to live. Right now, my neighborhood, she wouldn't, I wouldn't be able to buy a house in my neighborhood. What's it going to be like for her when she grows up? And I started thinking about well, there's a lot of things as an architect that I have the power to control. And one of those things is kind of the shape of housing. And so from there, kind of gone on this kind of quest where getting to know, advocating for backyard cottages, for other kind of housing types, any kind of dense housing that can fit into the city in neighborhoods that already exist. I've been a huge advocate for, and so it just springs from where we are now, what the sort of context of the city is, and the problems that we face. This kind of missing middle housing is key to solving climate change and also housing affordability and also addressing equity in our cities. So that's kind of where I come from.
I'd like to follow up with you just a little bit on what you think the definition or what comes to mind when you talk about missing middle, if there's any more fine point you could put on that.
Yeah, I mean, we basically have been building houses, detached houses for a couple generations, and that's been the sort of the dominant paradigm, except for now there's this realization about just how important transit-oriented development is, and everyone kind of understands that yeah, you put people near transit, that makes sense, but there's really nothing that we're building for the most part in between those two points. And so another thing that I really am concerned about with missing middle housing is that we have kind of a continuum of housing types between the single-family house and the big apartment building. We just can't build just those two things. We have to build everything in between. And since every community is a little bit different, every community can accept different levels of density or different housing types, and being open to all those other kinds of forms, historical and contemporary, is kind of a key adaptation that we need to embrace.
Thank you. Linda.
Good evening, Owen. Thanks so much for having me here tonight. I'm pleased to be here and speak to you about cottage housing and missing middle housing. My background, I should start and say, is not in construction. I'm not an architect. I am a builder these days, but it's not where I came from. Where I came from is consumer goods. I ran national department store product categories of goods, product development. And in that, I was acutely interested in what customers want to buy. Well, thinking about homes, it's another consumer product. It's another category of goods. It's the biggest purchase we'll ever make as individuals, but what is it that is compelling, and what is it, importantly, that might be missing? And I think there were a lot of us in this region, in this industry, that were quite excited about the renovation of Pine Street cottages that you saw up here in 1990, because that was a derelict cluster of 10 400-square-foot cottages that were built as worker housing early in our century, renovated in the late 80s, 1990, condominiumized, and offered for resale at the astronomical price of $90,000. God, who could believe it? And it set a lot of planners' heads spinning, because this was also the time of growth management. And we were struggling with new housing choices. And of course, I'm not trying to dominate this conversation, because we have a lot of good people to hear from. But that got me thinking about what is missing between the big apartment building, stacked flat condo, and a larger 3,000 square foot house. Maybe there's something in the middle. Maybe it looks like Pine Street cottages. Maybe it can captivate the excitement and passion of a single or couple home buyer. And maybe we should experiment with that a little bit. And in 1997, we finished our first project, 3rd Street Cottages in Langley, Washington, which many people have seen. And so that's what got me excited about it, and decided it could be a real business, and there you go.
Great.
Hello, I'm Eric Campbell, and I was one of the fortunate young kids at the University of Washington. I was going to business school. Our family had been in banking, and one of the things that we were taught was the one thing they don't teach at the business school is real estate. So they said, go get a summer job and go sell real estate. I said, oh, great. Rates were at 12.5% in 1985. I had my HP 12C, rates dropped to 10.5, and all of a sudden people started buying houses. And we were selling homes back then for $85,000 to $100,000. Great summer job. It was so good, I kept on selling real estate my junior and senior year. And long story short, I happened to be at the right time at the right place. One, Growth Management Act happened, and none of the home builders in this region believed in it. And like all 24 years olds, when you say, I got a great idea, I really understand that we can now do what we all want to do, that is build innovative product. All my home builders I was talking to said, nah, Eric, you're smart, but you're not that smart. So I started my own company, and that was CamWest Development. And long story short is because of the Growth Management Act, really allowed us to do a lot of innovative product. Now, the one thing we'll always say, you know, all to all my friendly Seattle architects, was all the innovation was happening on the east side. And if you go look at the master plan communities that we were able to build in, and the city of Kirkland, that's where you'll see the missing middle. You'll see townhomes, you'll see duplexes, you'll see triplexes, you'll see cottage housing, and that's where all the innovation happened. And also with Arch, we built, you know, hundreds, if not thousands, of units that targeted our, you know, lower AMI. So a lot to talk about, but the real thing is, I think the great news, we've done a lot over the last 15 years. The real question tonight is, why have we not continued to build up on all the great work we've done? And I think tonight will be a great way to talk about and hear from a lot of different people who have a lot of expertise.
Rick.
I too am delighted to be here and honored to be part of this panel with these distinguished folks. So I moved to Seattle in 1986 to teach part-time in the architecture department at the UW and to practice architecture. And I came here from Philadelphia, an older city, a more dense city, a city that was developed before the automobile. And In Philadelphia, you have an incredibly wide range of housing types. You have large downtown apartment buildings that then move to smaller apartment buildings that then move to stack flats and triplexes and quads that then move to large kind of townhouses on main streets that then move to very small row houses on smaller streets that then move to really tiny row houses on even smaller streets that then move to twin houses that then finally moves to detached single-family houses. This extraordinary range of housing types that both provide a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of the types of housing that are available, but also provides one with an incredible number of tools with which to design and develop the city. And so I was struck. It wasn't so much that I was critical of it, I was more confused when I first came to Seattle and I just saw endless neighborhoods of one single-family, detached single-family dwelling after another, and really very little else other than the limited amount of housing there was downtown. Now, of course, that didn't keep me from staying, and it didn't keep me from buying a house. I was able to buy a house in 1986 for $95,000. That house is now valued at about 11 times that much, but that's why I'm able to live in a house today. So I was able to buy a corner parcel in an in-city neighborhood, and shortly after the city passed its original ordinance allowing for accessory dwelling units in 1994, I started designing a house with an ADU. Detached accessory dwelling units were not allowed at that time. The ADU is as detached as it's allowed to be by code. It's barely attached. And when I built this, I received quite a bit of criticism, some praise, but quite a bit of criticism from people who were wondering why I was allowed to build 2 units on that property. It's single family. What those folks didn't know is that parcel, that corner parcel between Wallingford and Green Lake, decades before I bought it, had a mom and pop grocery store in the corner, 2 apartments above that, a separate commercial building next to it, and then a separate detached single-family dwelling next to that. 2 businesses, 3 dwelling units on one parcel, one single-family parcel. That is traditional neighborhood character in Seattle and a lot of its surrounding cities, not the blanket single-use, single-family zoning that we see today. So now, 34 years later, things have come somewhat full circle for me because I'm serving on the Seattle Planning Commission, and in December of last year, we released a report called Neighborhoods for All, where we are questioning single-family zoning and the lack of what has come to be called missing middle housing. It's basically a series of observations about the both social equity and environmental consequences of single-family zoning, as well as a number of recommended strategies as to how we might address it. So for me, the missing middle is really flexibility in terms of housing type, greater flexibility to accommodate a greater variety of households, ground-related housing without being a detached single-family dwelling, and also something that is between, it's already been mentioned, the ever-increasing scale of apartment buildings, mixed-use, multifamily buildings, and detached single-family dwellings. We're really creating a city that is polarized. You either live on an arterial in a really big apartment building, or if you're lucky enough, you live in a attached single-family dwelling in a quiet neighborhood, and we simply need more than that.
And I'm John Owen, and I'm especially honored to be on this panel with people that actually design and build housing, because I'm an urban designer, and my primarily effort is oriented towards creating more livable communities. I deal more with that, and a lot of it has to do with better roads and better infrastructure, better social capital among the different participants, but a lot of it does have to do with creating a greater spectrum of housing. And our firm does a lot of regulatory work, which is the zoning codes and design guidelines that shape the types of housing that can be built. And recently, I would say for forever actually, since we've been in this game, we've been trying to figure out how to allow a greater diversity of housing, because it's true, single-family housing doesn't fit everybody's needs, and it's certainly not fitting our needs now for a greater a denser, more equitable city. So a lot of what we've been doing recently is working on this issue from the community-driven or regulatory standpoint, trying to increase infill housing opportunities of cottage housing, ADUs, detached ADUs, and courtyard housing, for example, in cities like Wenatchee, in single-family neighborhoods, actually. Then at the same time, we're looking at different options and trying to create codes that would really encourage more compact, more sustainable housing types in some of the suburban and ex-urban areas. So it's both flip sides. We need this throughout our region. And increasingly, of course, we're dealing with the issue of affordability and how can we create more affordable housing. So we've been involved with the Seattle Inclusionary Housing effort, with the so-called HALA project there, and looking at other ways to provide some form of subsidy or incentives or encouragement for more affordable units as well as just more units.
Great, thanks so much. I think we're going to turn it over to all of you to be able to respond to this, and we're going to get to that conversation about the challenges of why this has not been applied on a broader scale. But I think what we want to start with is, where has this effort been successful? In some of your experiences, what were some of the specific conditions that were there to make for a successful housing development, both in terms of market conditions, the regulatory environment, and maybe give some specific examples. So open it up to any of you to chime in. Or I'll call on people. I'm happy to do that.
I'll jump in.
Great.
We've been successful in every community that we've built our projects. And so Lake Forest Park, Silverdale, Shoreline, Kirkland, Redmond, Langley. There has been a market for the product and the homes that we've built in each of those communities. Some, depending on location, have been more expensive than others. All have been relatively, and that is an important term, relatively more affordable than the typical 3,000 square foot big box single family home that is built in the same neighborhood for all kinds of reasons. But I would say the one thing, and Eric, you may have different insights, the jurisdiction and the political will and interest in innovation and experimentation has always been there. Kirkland is a very innovative kind of culture. Shoreline was, at the time we built Greenwood Avenue Cottages, very innovative and interested in experimenting with new housing choice. So the attitude on the council and planning commission and staff and the community at large was always one of interest in real innovation, in new housing choices. And that has served to make all of our projects successful, I think.
Go ahead, Rick. So it's interesting, and the reason why I mentioned the master plan communities like Issaquah Highlands, Redmond Ridge, Snoqualmie Ridge, that is where we were given the most flexibility. Those master plan communities use design guidelines, and they said, look, here's a density range you can have. And in the case, now there's still a lot of single family detached, but when they said, look, if you have 8, we'll give you anywhere from 8 to 20 dwelling units per acre, design what you want, that's where we had the most innovation. Mm-hmm. And that's where we were allowed to do duplexes, triplexes. Sometimes the townhomes were better. And then us also, we used a lot of courtyard concepts. You know, still that was a little bit more based around the vehicular courtyard. But the thing that was what I found, and I think, you know, both Linda and I had incredibly successful projects in Kirkland. The thing that's shocking is that Kirkland never would zone enough land for it. Yeah. Sell out, everyone would love it. And they would say, well, where else can you do it? And City of Kirkland
Not in
said,
Woodland.
well, we don't have any more land for it. And so that was one of the big, so I think, you know, in the case, one thing I would say that what I found that was, you know, useful is trying to find communities that had good design guidelines. Whenever we go to the public realm of starting to do design review, it's interesting how you get faults, you know, people saying, well, we don't like it because, you know, start telling you all the reasons on architecture. But the reality is, when you really got down to it, they considered more density to mean more traffic, even though the square footage is the same. And let me give you one example, and we'll move on, is that, for example, what both Linda and I have done is that let's say, for example, a cottage unit, 800 square feet, do two of those, you got 1,600 square feet, but yet the zoning allows 3,000 square foot homes. And we know, all you have to do is drive these neighborhoods, larger homes usually mean a 3-car garage. Why? Just like my family, kids who are driving, right? Well, when you get smaller units, you don't attract the same sort of type of buyer type. And so the problem is they confuse density with traffic. And that's, I think, one of the things that we'll talk more about tonight is that the false narrative that people use, that you know, instead of comparing just the square footage as allowed, you know, start talking and missing with unit type instead of saying, well, actually, what's the impact? And we can talk more about that later.
I can't bring any development experience to the table, but other than my own house, but as a member of the Planning Commission and a member of the City of Seattle's Accessory Dwelling Unit Working Group, we've been working a lot with folks at Portland State University, and Portland is a bit ahead of us in terms of ADU development. And we've learned some pretty interesting things from them. One is that legislative reform does help, reducing off-street parking requirements, increasing the size of the structure, any number of things that can really make it easier for people to build ADUs. But what they found was that while there was a little bit of a bump when they reformed their legislation, things really took off when they did a lot of community education and outreach, when they really educated people and let them know what they could do, when they got into partnership with AARP, who is very interested in alternative dwelling forms to this detached single-family house so that people can downsize while they're aging in place. Something they did that I thought was brilliant is they collaborated with real estate agents, and they developed what they called a real estate accessory dwelling unit certification program, so that real estate agents could have a little logo on their business card that they were a ADU certified agent, because they're often the first folks that are talking to homeowners. But one thing that I will talk a bit about tonight is I do think successful housing, especially successful housing that is more dense, is located close to transit. It is absolutely key. And I know in my case, I'm just plain lucky because of when I moved here, but I'm able to live in a neighborhood that is well served by frequent transit. And it makes my unit much more valuable than it would be otherwise, because tenants recognize that as being a real advantage.
Well, I'll pick up on something Rick said, and that is there's a lot you can do to encourage this kind of housing through education. A big issue with infill housing in urban areas is, trying to convince single-family homeowners that some of these different housing types can be beneficial. And I'm all for all this stuff. I really think we should be doing more cottage housing, infill, small lots, flag lots, all those kinds of things I think are very important in an overall strategy to provide housing. On the other hand, I think we need to work with single-family neighborhoods and not see them as the enemy. We need to get in there and work with them and make sure that they understand that these housing types and mixed-use development types, as Rick indicated, can be they can add a lot to a community, provide a much greater spectrum. It's a place that if you're tired of mowing your lawn, you can go and find a place to live in a small little place and And so it can be much more inclusive. So the other idea I'd like to throw out there, again, piggybacking on what Rick said, is I've always wondered if it wouldn't be useful to have somebody at the counter, at the city permit counter, so a homeowner could come in, not an architect or not a builder, but a homeowner could come in and get a little bit of free advice. Here's the basics you need to think about when you're putting in an ADU or a detached ADU, what we call a DADU. So a person at no charge could then know kind of what the parameters are, and then they could go off to an architect or a builder and pursue that. Because it is, from what I know about, particularly I'm speaking of ADUs and DADUs right now, they're right on the cusp. It's not always easy to make those things work. You have to have the right conditions, and it has to, you have to be in the right state of what you're paying for your home and all that other kind of thing. So some assistance to homeowners, I think, would be really good, and I really do believe that the ADU and DADU and split lot and all those other kinds of activities really can help and get a more, like I say, diverse and equitable community.
Great. Matt?
Oh, yeah, I wanted to build on a couple of other things. I think in some respects we sort of anticipate or rely on thinking about more people living around transit, but I think the place where I would want to see more and more people living and where I would want to live is near jobs, near parks, near schools, near shops, right? It's and it's not just the transit connection, it's the ability to walk and the ability to pick up a cup of coffee, grab a newspaper, go to the grocery store, catch a movie, walk home. That sort of a loop is kind of that sort of I think is the kind of livability holy grail. And where those places are in your city, in your neighborhood, are really the prime locations where you want to put people. The difficulty is those places are very prized for exactly those same reasons, and so often it's even harder to justify, as opposed to along an arterial, right, to justify putting more and larger development there. But you can imagine it's the Central Park kind of analogy, right? Living on Central Park is way more, has way more sort of quality of life than living 5 blocks away. The other thing I wanted to point out, one of those cottages at Pine Street just went up for sale. It's selling for $425,000. So,
We're
but
definitely
it's
going to get to that affordability question in a
yeah,
minute.
we'll get to that. But I think it's but also thinking about so that's 10 units on 15,000 square feet. 1,500 square feet per lot, and they share basically kind of a big backyard and not much else. And I feel like many people would choose to live there if given the choice between that and someplace that isn't walkable, that's too big, that they aren't close to transit or schools or parks or can't get a cup of coffee. So.
Great. So I think we're going to try flipping this question on its head now and talking about more the challenges and the constraints to developing this housing type, and kind of getting at both that micro level, some of the challenges that you see as a developer, but also on the macro level, why aren't we seeing this at a bigger scale? So open it up.
Well, I'll start it off, and then we can start. So I think it depends upon, first, it's the neighborhood. Rick's doing a lot of hard work trying to get Seattle to finally break open. But on the east side, i.e. Kenmore all the way down to, let's say, Newcastle, it really is because there is a lack of zoned properties for this innovative type of housing. I think the reality is most cities, and Kirkland falls into this, I'll pick on them, is that they said, hey, we're going to hit, and we're going to kind of geek out on urban planning for you guys. We're going to hit our housing targets by doing our urban centers. And what that means is Puget Sound Regional Government said, each city will have an allocation, so many new housing units, and if they can jam it all into these urban areas, then they will say, we don't have to touch our neighborhoods. And I think this gets back to Rick's comment and everyone else's comment, is how do we educate neighborhoods to say, you have a choice. You can do nothing and let your older neighborhood, that old bungalow, get torn down and have it be a multi-million-dollar home, or you can have something, could even be less square footage, and let it be a duplex or a triplex. And that's the discussion I think we've had in Seattle. The thing is, what makes the east side easier, we have wider streets. And those wider streets make for a lot easier parking. And that's, I think, the biggest impediment to Seattle. Is some of those streets are so narrow, it's tough for them, neighborhoods to swallow. Even though Magnolia is the toughest opponent, where they have the most largest streets.
And bigger lots.
Yeah.
Bigger lots.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. We are seeing, in 2018 in Seattle, small houses, say 800,000 square foot bungalows, were torn down and replaced by 4,500 to 5,000 square foot single family houses faster than we were building ADUs. So, I mean, Seattle has the same issue, though. I mean, we have the urban village growth strategy, and so 75% of our land in Seattle, one of the fastest growing cities in the country, that is zoned for residential use is zoned single family. 75%. 95% of the city's growth has gone into the 25% that's zoned for multifamily since 2010. 5% has gone into single family zones. And in fact, some of our single family neighborhoods have lost population since the 1970s. This is purely due to household demographics. It's still bizarre. One of the fastest growing cities in the country, neighborhoods are losing population while others explode with growth. It's simply not an equitable relationship. In terms of ADUs, for example, I mean, removing code barriers will definitely help. Education and outreach will definitely help. But one of the interesting things that is a quandary is wealth. Too little wealth, in one case, where someone simply they don't have the cash, and they don't have the equity in their house to afford to build an ADU. Or the flip side, and I don't have a lot of data to support this, but I know there are a lot of people who have agreed with me on this, we have a lot of wealth in the city. And a lot of people who buy a detached single-family house don't buy that parcel to share it with another household. They buy it to have it for themselves. So I think this inequitable distribution of wealth is a major factor in terms of the lack of change that we're seeing in a lot of our neighborhoods.
Well, I'd certainly agree with that. I'd like to pick up a little bit on something Matt said and about the desirability of a neighborhood. Of course, the more desirable the neighborhood you have, your price goes up. And so for years, meaning we, the cities in Western Washington, have been trying to improve neighborhoods by adding parks and neighborhood businesses and all that type of thing. And what we've done is kind of gentrify those neighborhoods. So that's the flip side of all this. So that's why we really need to focus on some affordability issues and figure out how we can get housing for all in some of these more desirable places. But at the same time, again, picking up on what Matt says, what we find is people like walkable neighborhoods, but if you don't make sure that you have small businesses in your neighborhood, they're not going to be walkable. If you really look at it, and you need about 1,000 residents. I'm sorry, not 1,000 residents, 1,000 dwelling units within roughly a quarter to a half a mile area to support a neighborhood business district. At least you need 3,000 overall, but 1,000 of those can be within walking distance. So if you look at your neighborhood and you say, well, geez, we only got 500 within that quarter mile radius, you're not going to get those kind of amenities that you want. But if you have 1,000, 1,500 is better. Then you begin to see not only some of the businesses becoming viable, and I don't mean big businesses, I mean the small corner grocery store or the yoga studio and all that type of thing, the coffee shop. Then all that becomes viable. So that's a good carrot to put out there. I know, I was talking with Linda earlier that in her neighborhood, the community came to the city of Seattle and said, we want to upzone our parts of our neighborhood. We want to get some of the 5/1, even much more dense than we're talking here. And at that time, Seattle turned us down. I couldn't believe it. But it really helps a neighborhood to have this diversity in more ways than one. So I just wanted to pick up on what Matt said.
I would add to that, in 2012, we established a real estate brokerage as an ancillary business to our development business. And we are actively involved in resales, often, of communities we have built and sold previously. And that's a very good business. If you want to be on our email list, cottagecompany.com. Sign up. But I would like to add that the first question our buyers or prospective buyers ask is, what can I walk to? What can I walk to? And this is a real problem in many neighborhoods and communities that were built post-World War II. There is no neighborhood commercial. And when they think of neighborhood commercial, meaningful neighborhood, we're not talking about a strip mall with a taco time. We're talking about nothing wrong with taco time. But think about our post-war communities. Where's that corner store? Where's the neighborhood coffee shop, the bakery? They don't want to get in their automobiles to drive. They want to walk to pick up. So how do we retrofit that kind of meaningful neighborhood commercial into our already built? In Rose Hill and Kirkland is a classic example. All single family, lovely parks, a beautiful neighborhood, nothing to walk to. Arterials with bus lines, nothing to walk to.
Any final thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I sort of feel like one thing that I want Seattle to focus on is this sort of the places for your side hustle, to grow. The idea that you can for the most part, commercial spaces are outlawed in this sort of single family zone, but you really want to be able to have daycares. You really want to be able to have those happen on every other block. You want to have these kind of small places that maybe don't require a lot of foot traffic, professional offices, those sorts of things, that then grow into more businesses. And that's something that I think we see in old neighborhoods. We don't see today because they've been zoned out of existence. But whenever I drive around or I'm walking around and I see one of those, I'm like, oh man, a corner store. But why can't we do that? And the other thing is why can't we do that now just by changing the way that we address the zoning at corners? Rick talks about changing having the street relationship kind of dictate the zoning. It really makes a lot of sense to look at important corners, even if they're residential, and give those little extra flexibility to do a little something more because they are important places.
Yeah. Could I add one other thing?
Yeah.
So, related to this Neighborhoods for All report that I mentioned, my fellow planning commissioners and I are going out to neighborhoods, neighborhood by neighborhood, to present this information and to get their thoughts about it. And what we found so far, this is hardly a scientific survey, but when we go to the neighborhoods that are a little further out, places like Broadview, Bitter Lake, which is in the northeast corner of the city, neighborhoods that actually don't have sidewalks yet, they are amazingly receptive to this idea because they want that walkability that Matt's talking about. They want that diversity of housing types. They want to be able to walk to the corner store, which I initially found really surprising and incredibly encouraging. And so we, the commission, have decided, okay, let's just go to those neighborhoods first and kind of figure this out, and then we'll go to the closer in neighborhoods like where I live that are really resistant to growth.
Just one point on that, Rick, on the walkability issue, which we've all known for years, that walkability is kind of the driver of great housing. You're talking about the old King County, right? And this is where Kenmore has a real tough issue, because it was an old King County. So very few of the neighborhoods have the sidewalks already put in. And where the city of Kirkland, like Lori can attest to, huge debates about saying, when new development comes in, do you force them to build new sidewalks? And I think the reality is, it's a bitter pill, but either you got two choices. Either you make that development, put the sidewalks in as they're going in, or you somehow do improvement districts, or where you say, hey, we're going to put the street, we're going to put the sidewalks in, and homeowners, when you do redevelop, you pay us back a bit. And so you have to do it. And I really think it's as we can tell, I'm just, side story, the redevelopment of downtown Bothell had a lot of debate, even the business owners that had this huge, beautiful road put in, and they said, well, we don't want to pay for it. So walkability helps drive value. It will create more affordable housing if, you guys do the proper zoning, but don't sacrifice the sidewalks. Deal with a tough problem. And so I know that's not what we're here to talk about tonight, but yet that's it's a real big issue.
Are we still talking about challenges?
Yeah, yeah.
Could I add something then?
Yeah.
Because I want to talk about the 800-pound gorilla in this, and that's parking. Because a lot of the resistance to infill housing, particularly in urban areas, is the parking issue. So you add an ADU or a DADU or a cottage housing complex, and first thing that the neighbors are going to worry about is the parking. And I think you have to be kind of gird your loins on that one and really look and do the due diligence and see if there is a parking problem, because people will perceive a parking problem before there is one, frankly. And you have to look very carefully. I think you have to honor existing residents' concerns, but you have to kind of push the envelope a little bit about, having fewer on-site parking stalls and use parking in the streets. And maybe you have some kind of a parking zone or something that allows neighbors to park there. What do they call it? RPZs. So maybe you do something like that. But there's a lot of strategies you can have to handle parking and reduce the amount of parking that's required, because that's a huge expense. I'm sure the panelists will nod their heads on that. And we've found in where we've reduced parking requirements, we've gotten higher quality housing, much more dense housing, and it fits better in the neighborhood. So there's a lot of benefits of reducing the parking requirements if you can do that. So I would encourage you to really look at that as a first step in challenges. And I will also mention the other issue here to some of these things is whether or not you have an alley. A lot of it has to do with site contacts. Whether you have a corner lot makes a big difference. So those are the kinds of things that you want to do. And while we're talking challenges, density. What we're doing right now in the regulatory regimes is trying to not talk about density. It's not about density. It's about all the conditions that people have with their neighbors. So if you can solve those conditions, you don't need any density requirements. So those are the three challenges that I see that we can reduce from a regulatory standpoint.
Great. Well, this is actually a good segue to get a little deeper into the weeds and talk specifically about the densities that are necessary to make these types of products feasible. And I think it kind of picks up on that theme of the economic conditions and forces that you're battling out there when you're competing with other types of development, seeking that scarce land. So just from a regulatory perspective, where are the appropriate density levels, if you can get kind of specific about that are needed for this type of housing?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, typically we build 8 to 12 units per acre. Now, some cottage housing has been built more densely than that. Smaller footprint housing, like Pine Street cottages, for instance, 400 square feet. So you could build up to, let's say, 16 units to the acre. Our homes typically have 800 to 1,000 square foot footprints, and so they occupy a little more land than 400 square feet. But that's detached housing. So if one were to build attached cottage courts, which certainly exist, and there's lots of great examples built pre-war. The Anhalt examples, for instance, in Seattle, they're lovely. You could build more densely than that. So I think, but every site is different, and we build infill on infill sites. So we wish we had the luxury of master plan communities with a lot more flexibility, but we're limited with each property. I'm in entitlements right now on a property that we could build 12. We're actually building 9 because, frankly, it just isn't going to fit. And every site is a little bit different. So, but generally, that's the densities that we're looking for in single-family zones. Single-family zones. That's very important.
Really quick, Linda's correct, anywhere from that 8 to 24 dwelling units per acre, depending upon what you want. And then I think the other thing is, and this gets back to, but if you just go on the single-family lot and you're trying to maybe, not be radical, but actually you can be pretty innovative if you just look at what's allowed, already on the footprint and just say, okay, you can go ahead, Mr. Homeowner or Mrs. Homeowner, you can do duplex, triplex, fourplex. We'll let you do it. No greater setbacks, and no larger massing. That's really the easier way to do it because I think, as Matt's designs showed, and I know with Rick's home and so on, you can have a duplex or a triplex or even a fourplex look like a single family home. And if you want to, you can even deal with that parking challenge. I mean, you just have only one car per unit, or you do one car tandems. It's not perfect because, we know some reduced parking would be ideal, but you can deal with it gradually because I still believe right now, especially with Kenmore, is on the precipice where you still can get ahead of the curve and let people have more choice on what to build versus coming in and just going and allow the mega mansions that we're seeing throughout the whole region.
A lot of what our work is on single-family lots in Seattle, which means 4,000, 5,000 square feet. Recently, Seattle passed a new zoning or created a new zone, which took single-family lots and essentially allowed twice or 3 times the density, reduced the minimum sort of lot area to 2,000 instead of 5,000. And also allowed an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit per primary. And so we're doing projects now that in formerly single-family neighborhoods where there's an existing one-story house, with maybe a daylight basement, we're adding a second story. We're converting the basement to 2 ADUs. We're taking the existing house and kind of splitting it side by side, and it's becoming a duplex. The perception from the street is that they've just popped the top, but we've added 3 units. In the backyard, because of the density allowances now, we're building another house, and it has an ADU. So we're taking a single-family lot that was 6,000 square feet, and we now have 6 units. And this particular client wants to basically have kind of an apartment building and rent all those out. And and I find that we can do that pretty well. I mean, its scale relative to its neighbors is not, it's not shocking, jarring, and we're approaching this sort of, where we can, have sort of a common area and a common space, in the backyard that really makes sense. And with 6 households, that's like enough to sort of fuel a sense of community.
I think I mentioned that I'm going to be teaching a design studio in the winter at the UW focused on this issue, basically focused on what do we do in single-family zones, or what we currently call single-family zones. And one of the first questions students will be confronted with is, what do we most value about these neighborhoods? And so Eric mentioned, and he's absolutely right, that just simply taking the existing allowable zoning envelope in single family, you could build a triplex or even a quad and it would look exactly like the houses that are currently being built. That would preserve the backyard, right? So you would still have this open space in the center of the block. And so we need to ask the question, is it the preservation of the existing building stock that's most important? Certainly in a lot of these older neighborhoods. For some people it is. Well, in that case, you're probably looking at an infill strategy, similar to what Matt was talking about, where you're building something in the backyard. But then you're losing some of that open space in the backyard. Or you accept the fact that we're willing to lose some of the existing building stock, and instead we're going to build a new, larger structure, but it's going to have more units in it, but that's going to retain that open space in the backyard. So I just think there's some kind of global questions that we need to be asking, and it's not as if it's a one-size-fits-all scenario. It could easily vary from neighborhood to neighborhood or even block to block. But those are the kinds of questions that we really need to start having, as opposed to the discussion that we've been having to date, which is yes or no. Are we going to do it at all? We don't have to talk about parking that much, but I completely agree with John. It's always the elephant in the room. I have strong opinions about parking. But one thing that would really help is if we stopped giving it away for free. If we stopped giving away our public rights of way for people to store their privately owned vehicles, that would go a very long way to helping to address the problem.
If I could bang on the parking thing one more time. There's a great website that Metro has put out called I think it's Right Size Parking. Do something like that, and it's fun to do. It'll tell you, you could zero in on a given property, and it'll tell you what the expected parking requirements, not requirements, what the expected parking behavior will be of that. So it'll tell you how many stalls or parking spots that use would generate, and it's pretty sophisticated. It's about whether you're putting in a sixplex or a duplex. It'll tell you whether you're putting in, the neighborhood. It factors in the walkability. So if you want some fun, if you're into this stuff, do right size parking through the Metro website, and it's entertaining, if nothing else. And we should be adopting this kind of thinking. And it would be great to have it in Snohomish and Thurston County, too, and just say, okay, well, your parking requirements, basically that.
Great. This is a great conversation. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I think some of you have done a really good job of speaking to this already, but how do we talk about compatibility with the surrounding neighborhood? I think the reality is we are talking about, as you said, changing what is already there. And so what are the ways that you can bring ideas, whether it's how we talk about it, how we articulate the value and the benefits of adding this housing, or from a design standpoint, how do we blend this in a way that complements the existing neighborhoods?
I'll start, because that's my job. I do think that the design guidelines are very important, and it varies depending upon what kind of community you're in. If you're in a less dense, more suburban, or even exurban kind of community, it's very different than if you're in a more dense Seattle-type neighborhood. But I do think that there's some very simple design guidelines that you can apply. It doesn't necessarily need to make it a more complicated process. It doesn't need to take any more time. I think it can be both flexible and also provide some predictability, which builders definitely do need. There are ways to do that. And I think it doesn't have to be complicated. I think it's just a few simple things. If you're in a historic neighborhood, then maybe you do have, it depends upon what your roof pitch is and all that other kind of, the kind of window you have and all that stuff. But in a lot of cases, it's really just simple that you have a gracious transition from the public to the private realm, that you are a good neighbor in the sense that you're not overlooking somebody's hot tub, although it's sometimes hard to avoid that. But just a few simple things, and it doesn't necessarily cost a heck of a lot of money, or doesn't mean that you need a super duper setback or all these other things. In fact, I think in a lot of cases, if you have design guidelines, you can ease up on some of the dimensional standards that you would normally have. And by the way, I do think, we talked about the single-family homes versus some form of multifamily, duplex, triplex, or ADUs. It seems to me that what Seattle's proposing in that limit the bulk of a single-family house, what they call the FAR or floor area ratio, basically how big your house can be, limiting that for single-family houses, and but allowing more for your additional units would be a good strategy, not only in dense Seattle, but everywhere.
I personally have advocated for that myself at various points in time. So, other thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to build on that. The impetus for that is in part that by reducing the kind of bulk, right now, like in Seattle, you could build a giant house, right? These McMansions were allowed by right. And then a family of two would, move in there, and it would just be, and, tear down an old house and have this sort of out of scale sort of statement that's really, I think, really jarring. And by having these floor area ratio controls that kind of reduce the overall size, but then created bonuses for accessory dwelling units, those in Seattle are free, they don't count towards that FAR. It disincentivizes McMansions and bakes in the ability for that structure to have multiple households in it. So there's an incentive to create places where more than one household can live. And at the same time, when you're talking about compatibility, or I should say like generating the political will to overcome kind of, I think, people's reticence about thinking about like, well, gosh, my neighbors, suddenly I'm gonna have twice as many people in my neighborhood. How is that gonna change? I think by pairing this kind of an anti-McMansion impulse with incentivizing extra houses, it actually creates more houses that are more structures that are at scale with the existing neighborhood, and also more places for more housing options. And so it's really kind of a win-win. And I feel like that's part of why Seattle was able to pass what is probably the most progressive ADU law this past summer.
Yeah, and as I recall, Matt, I think you were pretty instrumental. Your advocacy was pretty instrumental in getting that FAR cap
Yes, thank you.
into it. I've always been impressed with Portland and their approach to land use planning. And so it has not yet passed. It may not pass, but they have been working on something called the Residential Infill Project for some time. And it takes all the things that Matt's been talking about a couple of steps further. It uses floor area ratio to incentivize certain things, like preserving the existing structure on the property, like providing an affordable unit, providing a semi-accessible unit where someone can age in place. There's something also really smart that they did, which is they identified a series of really unpopular development patterns in single-family zones, skinny houses being one of them. Another one being, we see them all over my neighborhood, large new single-family houses where the entire house is lifted a full story above grade, and the street is faced with nothing other than a two-car garage door and a full-width concrete parking apron. And so they basically said, okay, part of this is we're going to not allow those anymore, and then we're going to allow this other stuff. So I thought it was a really politically smart move, where they used it to address things that they knew people didn't like, while they were also trying to come up with ways of incentivizing things that people do like and that people were interested in seeing happen in the neighborhoods. It's still controversial, and it might not pass, but they're getting close.
One last quick part we also probably forgot about, and this is where Seattle probably leapt through and didn't maybe do. We were talking about, Rick, you mentioned the open space. East side cities, a little bit more sensitive to trees. Seattle has lost a lot of trees, and this is this is one of the things that I think you have to be cognizant of, and that's where that's a balance. And that's why, probably duplex, triplex, fourplex works a lot better than some of the opportunities. But again, I think the real lesson here is reach out to the neighborhoods, talk to them, and see what's really most important, right? Because every city is different. But having predictable design guidelines. But one comment that you guys all went through, here's from the developer that I think it's got to be brought up, and I think you bring it up here a bit, Lindsay, but I'll jump forward, is if you want to create affordable housing, you just can't pass it. You also have to say, how do we make it happen? And one of the big problems on the east side cities, Seattle doesn't have this issue, is our impact fees. And like city of Redmond, I think we're talking $35,000 for a single family home, even applicable to the accessory dwelling unit. So even before you start, you're eroding away affordable housing. And so the question is, can you have waivers for ADUs? Or can you at least get a waiver if it's, an ADU in the basement? So there's a lot of things that, I know we're going to talk about, but I want to bring up before we forget about it, because just zoning for affordability won't get us there. We have to then start to say, how do we actually make it so we're not, squeezing the golden goose so much? And right now, impact fees on the east side is huge. Seattle's just started to think about doing impact fees. That's how yeah. But we have school. I think, what is it, school fees now in Bothell
Park
is
School.
$16,000 for the North Shore School District for one single family home. Used to be 0 3 years ago.
Great. Well, if we're ready, I think we will dive straight into the big topic of affordability. And I'm going to kind of pair a couple questions together. I think in general, there is both belief and also skepticism about how affordable are these products really and who is living in them. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you know of who tends to live in these types of developments and how affordable they really are, kind of to what price points or income levels.
Well, I would just say affordability is relative, first of all. But the real truth is that we as a region have to come to grips with affordability can't be even scratched the surface of without drastically increasing the supply of housing out there. We don't have enough housing, period. And that's why you see Pine Street cottages going from $90,000 to $425,000. The cottage didn't change at all. It's the lack of supply. That's why you see my Danielson Grove project in Kirkland, which we built in 2005. It sold for $600,000 in a time that the typical new home in the neighborhood was $1 million. Recently resold for over $1 million. Why? It didn't change. There's nothing bigger about the cottage. But we don't have enough supply of housing. So that's why this issue is so critical. All of these housing choices, we need more of them, and we need them right now, and we need them everywhere.
If I could build on that, I completely agree with Linda. The King County Affordable Housing Task Force estimates that in King County, we are currently shy about 156,000 units of housing. And by 2040, that number will climb to about 244,000 units. So there's a really important scale issue here that we need to be thinking about. And it's one of the things for me that it gives me pause when I think about or the city putting a lot of resources and energy into ADUs as a strategy to address our housing affordability. It's a very popular strategy because it's generally accepted by people who live in these neighborhoods. But it really is a question of, will we ever get to scale with those kinds of strategies, or do we need to be looking at something much more radical? So I put that on the table. But in terms of affordability, I also agree with Linda that it's relative. It really varies. The folks that have lived in my unit, generally couples, they have all had a higher household income than I do. But it is an opportunity, getting back to Matt's point about walkability, access to parks and good schools and all of that stuff. It's that small number of rental units in those neighborhoods that give people who can't afford to buy an $850,000 house access to those amenities that they otherwise wouldn't have. So it's really more than just affordability. It's even more than the number of units. It's where are the units and who has access to those units. But there are some pretty interesting programs happening around the country, and Seattle is looking into this as well, which is assisting a low-income homeowner both with technical assistance and financial assistance to build an accessory dwelling unit. And in exchange for that, they will rent that unit to a housing choice voucher holder, which is typically about 50% of area median income, for a stipulated period of time. It might be 5 years. It's an incredible story. It's a really inspiring thing where you can do two things at once. You can help someone who's at risk of losing their house stay in it, and you can also provide an affordable housing unit as inexpensively as possible, because there's no land cost. The land is already owned. But it comes back to this question of scale. L.A. Moss, a firm in Los Angeles, has built 5 of these things over the last 5 years. So
That's not much.
yeah, what do we do?
Just from the market side, just kind of give you here's, like both what Linda and I did. I always, just to let you know, Linda built such gorgeous stuff. We always said, you know what, we're going to actually add a garage and have a really nice quality home and still sell it for 20% less, and so our homes that we were selling during that same time that were in the 450s now resell for the 800s. However, the neighborhood is all selling for about $1.2 million. And so the point being is, I usually think, when we go either with anywhere from a cottage to a attached duplex, triplex, you are going to be 30% below the market to an equivalent house. So it's a great way to get more affordability within the neighborhood. And you've seen Vancouver, British Columbia do this with the big Cambria rezone. They did this for 500 acres. They said, we know, be it townhomes or other attached housing, that's the only way to do it. And this is also a great way to get better walkability for a neighborhood, quicker. Don't be small, 5 acres, 2 demonstration projects, doesn't do it. So there's a real big opportunity. So it's really trying to find those neighborhoods that say, you know what, we want sidewalks in our neighborhood. If we do, we're willing to, be more innovative. So that's the one thing. And then I think the last thing, which we've been subject to on the multifamily side, and here's the good news. I think on the family, on our rental, on our urban nodes, Seattle's actually already hitting the tipping point of we are creating more affordable housing than what people really know on the street. Like right now, I just saw that, we have some units available for, less than $1,500 right across the street. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal until you find out that in San Francisco, there's no way you could do that. So Seattle's, the good news on the rental side, I think we really got on the, apartments. We're going to solve that. Also, some inclusionary housing. I'm one of the proponents for it. Don't tell the other developers, I get in big trouble for it. But it's really what we're talking. The missing middle is where we need real leadership. And that's why I really appreciate everyone in the room at least listening to the opportunity, because if we are quick, I mean quick in the next 2 years or so, we have a chance to really get a lot of these neighborhoods before it's just priced out.
Well, did you have one more thing to add? Okay. I do want...
I'll add just
Okay.
a little bit. I mean, I think that all this is good that we're talking tonight, but it's only a part of the equation. I mean, I think we need some much denser, much more aggressive types of housing at the upper, the missing top, I think. The other thing is we've lost a lot of, the national government, the federal government, is basically asleep at the wheel right now for housing. I mean, we have a national crisis, and it's really one of the things that's driving the inequity in our society. So if you really look at it, I mean, we have a serious societal problem that we can work our best at trying to fix, but it's going to take a much larger effort than we are currently generating right now. The good news, I think, in addition to what Eric says, I think we have some really good nonprofits around that are doing really good projects in the region on creating some affordable housing through subsidies and grants, and they cobble together a whole bunch of different loans and grants and things, and do a great job of providing some affordable housing in some of our actually wealthier neighborhoods. So all is not lost, but I think the real thing we have to remember is that it's far deeper than just adding an ADU here or there. It's really about changing the way we take care of ourselves in our society.
Well, I do want to challenge some of you a little bit to think about, despite the fact that a lot of this is driven by the market and maybe it's the product naturally sits about 30% below market, are there ways that you can make some of these housing types available to people with even lower incomes? Because I think we all know that is where the biggest gap is in access to some of these neighborhoods. And so I challenge you kind of to think about that and what ideas you might have.
Well, we had an affordable unit as a condition of the Conover Commons project, 50% of median income. We sold it at that time through the ARCH program. We sold it for actually less than it cost us to build it. Less than the sticks and bricks and hammers and nails and labor that it actually cost to construct it. So affordable housing has to be subsidized in some manner. And in this case, it was subsidized by the 24 other home buyers that purchased in that community. And they continue to subsidize the monthly HOA fees for that unit, as it is a condominium, and there are HOA fees associated. Not in perpetuity, but as that is, it might be 30 years. It's long time. Long time. So it's tough. You know, when you consider, I have a colleague building in Federal Way right now, and I chatted with him on the way over here, and I said, what are you selling these houses for in Federal Way? $450 to $500. They just closed on their first 5 of a 18 home project. And I said, okay, tell me the truth. What's really costing here? He says, I'm breaking even at $475. Breaking even. Land, site development cost, wood, roof. That's the real cost of construction. And so we have to, these are 1,400 square foot units. We have to just think about that.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges, you know, and you're always going to hear always developers and builders moan, but is cost of construction has gone up so much. It's, for even in the last 6 years, it's doubled in this region. And we know there's a host of reasons behind that. But here's some of the more innovative ways. First and foremost, it's also having government be a little bit smarter too. I'll give you an example. Lindsay's not, you know, she'll get picked on. She hasn't enacted this yet, but her predecessor did this. So in the city of Kirkland, we have inclusionary housing for any time we do a new condominium project or anything of a certain size. Sometimes it's so drastic, you'll see nothing but 9-lot short plats, but there could have been 12-unit plats because it's so drastic. And I'll give you an example. If we're doing a 20-unit condominium building in Kirkland, 2 of those units have to be affordable. Currently, the affordability of those units are around $350,000. In Kirkland, that's basically almost the price of the ground. So anything you're doing, you're losing. Now, the thing that's crazy, those might be in the best location in Kirkland. We could take that money that we'd be, you know, let's say, instead of selling a unit for 1.1 to 1.5 million and give it to 2 people and they get the golden ticket forever, we could say, you know what, let's just take the money and we'll go buy 2 or 3 units up in Kingsgate, hit who really needs to live there, i.e. the fireman, the teacher, who's willing, like all of us probably were, our first houses were all probably 2-bedroom, 1 bath, where we did a lot of sweat equity. So one of the things is some of our government programs aren't targeting the right people. They're just, you know, so we got to be a little bit more innovative on how we do fee in lieu and other aspects. Second thing is, I already spoke about city government having to get, if we're going to do more, look at the impact fees, understand that it is a huge cost. You know, $30,000 just to, you know, before you break ground. And as we know, many of our, you know, our requirements have become more complicated So it's also be a little bit more innovative about being able to reuse plans and so on. And that's, and we'll let, Rick and Matt speak to that. But, they may not like it, but they can design one project. I love that building so much. They say, hey, do you mind if I go build it 4 or 5 times and only pay you a smaller fee? I usually don't like that as much, but it can be done. And then lastly, the other thing is also let us build to the market, i.e. when we're going affordable. A lot of times, again, this is Lindsay's predecessor, was saying, well, if you're going to build more affordability in these young projects, the homes can't look any different. I go, that's fine from the outside, but on the inside, it doesn't need to be a 2,500 square foot home. If it's affordable, what would someone be happy with? And if it's only 800 square feet, that's okay. And that's the part we have to be a little bit more innovative. So the problem is some of it, the private side has to be more innovative, but government has to not be so punitive too. They have to be more flexible, more realistic, and say, let's really solve the problem. Because I know for a fact, if I had right now any houses in Kenmore for $400,000, they'd be lying. We have a lottery right now. So, it doesn't matter what size they are.
I'm gonna double up on that in that a lot of what we experience as architects in like trying to get projects permitted is basically regulations that are well intended but add a lot of complexity. The average packet to go through design review is might be $60,000 worth of design fees for maybe 20 units or something like that. And just imagine if you could just not spend that money on paper and spend it on exterior materials, or in the case of affordability, not spend it and not pass it on as part of the sales price. I think that we look at these regulations and we're like, well, I understand where the intent was, but or but how does it actually work? For example, in the brand new residential small lot zone, there was this intent to create a pathway to that back unit in the back. And so how do we do that? So there's a code in there. There's a one little design review thing that we have to do, and that's that the pavement to that front door has to be a different color. Like, so we just like paint it pink or whatever. It's like is that really a salient important part that we have to spend money on, or would this be just equally the same if we just trusted that people are going to be able to find the front door? And so, yeah, I mean that's a bigger failing. Yeah, and so I do feel like too many times when we experience regulation, it starts out high-minded, but how it's applied makes it really, really difficult to execute.
All of this is true. And there's no question that we need to, we being policymakers, have to make it easier for the market to build housing, especially when we're just doing kind of silly things along the lines of what Matt was mentioning. But I really appreciate John's role in this session, which is pointing to the elephant in the room on several occasions. And the elephant in the room is that we need a lot more public funding for housing, a lot more than we have. And it's interesting to watch the current city council debates. And everybody's talking about housing, and no one is really saying that. They're all talking about those little tweaks that we can do, which are no question. It'll make it less expensive, but it won't make it a lot less expensive. I'm part of a group that's looking at how we can leverage our $60 billion regional investment in light rail transit and bus rapid transit to ensure that we build complete walkable communities with lots of housing around all of these 60 additional light rail stations that we're going to be building between now and 2040, spending $60 billion to do it. And if you just do a kind of back of the napkin calculation using the King County Affordable Housing Task Force numbers, it's about $65 billion worth of funding for housing, which is just like, that's insane. Except we're spending $60 billion on a light rail transit system because we decided some years ago that we were facing a transportation crisis in our region. And we decided we can step up and figure out how to pay for this, and we'll do it. And we're kind of in the same situation with housing. We really are talking about something that's at that scale. And we're talking about a crisis that's at least as dire as the transportation crisis that we were facing a decade ago and continue to face today. So we need a lot more money. And I think the irony of a lot of, I'm a big fan of mandatory housing affordability in Seattle, but the reality, what we're really doing is we're kind of making newcomers pay for affordable housing, where we should really all be paying for affordable housing.
The only tough part with this, and this is one of the toughest issues we know we face, is in the state of Washington, a lot of those things come with higher property taxes. And those property owners sacrifice so hard to make their mortgage payment. And that's where, I'll never forget, National Association of Home Builders had an editorial in 1988 about this one issue. And the toughest part is, the person who saves, for that house, and then says, I'm going to give my money so someone else doesn't have to work as hard as me. And that's one of the biggest challenges we have is, this one fundamental discussion. And this is the reason why it's not easy, but saying, how do you find different tax sources?
Right. But all of us who live in houses we own live in subsidized housing through the mortgage interest tax deduction.
It's been reduced. I think actually not in our neighborhood. It's gone. The new tax law took it away for anything over, $1 million?
Yeah.
It's gone now. So.
I personally love this debate, but
I know, different issue. Stay on point.
I could talk about that all night long. I'm going to kind of bring it back here to where we are tonight and talk about Kenmore specifically, because I think we're in a community that's willing to have these conversations and has welcomed all of us to bring our knowledge and expertise and help them think about how do they do this. So I'm going to ask a few specific questions just in this Kenmore context. One is just a frank question about, is there a market for this type of housing in a more suburban community like Kenmore?
Absolutely.
I was going to say that's easy.
Absolutely. Not even a question.
That's the end of the answer. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, we've worked in lots of different suburban places. Cottages are selling in Federal Way. Cottages sold in Langley on Whidbey Island. Cottages sold in Shoreline and Silverdale. I mean, there's a market everywhere. Consider how many people that are single or an empty nester couple seeking to resize or a young single professional. Do you know any of those folks? They're all prospective buyers.
Here's what's ironic. The more expensive the neighborhood, the more demand there is for more innovative housing types.
Yes.
So where we're more in outlying areas, the land is not as large a component as the price. So in Kenmore, we're in one of those areas where, all you have to do is look at the prices of everything south of us. High demand for any type of innovative housing.
I think the key is to take a look at your community and not ask, is it appropriate in Kenmore, but where is it appropriate in Kenmore? And take a look. I think you could be much more specific about your strategies and orient them towards the specific neighborhoods or centers like the downtown, for example, that you have here. So that would be what I would recommend.
Well,
but I'm sure Linda's right that the overall market is there. It's how to leverage it the most effective way in a specific area.
Well, the next step is, as you're right, John, is identifying particular properties. Again, back to the what can I walk to. So we have a town center. All right, let's look 10-minute walk out from this place right now. What properties are out there? Any acre properties around? Let's go talk about them.
There's an acre parking lot right to the south of us.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to turn that question right back to you because that was our next question, and it is, what are the types of neighborhoods that provide the best opportunity? I heard some earlier discussion about maybe it's the farther out neighborhoods that are a little bit more eager to bring some amenities to them, or maybe it's the closer in ones that have already got that walkability. So talk a little bit about that in the Kenmore context.
Just hit this on the
Kenmore.
yeah. So the thing about Kenmore is kind of unique, and this is the reason why, everyone has all the residents have a real interesting situation. Because Kenmore was built under King County regulations, not city regulations, there's a little bit less infrastructure. And so it would be really interesting to know what the residents, which neighborhoods would like to see more density. That would include the sidewalks and other of the amenities. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but it really has to go out to the neighborhoods and finding out, who's willing to accept, maybe, different forms of housing in lieu of just waiting and being passive and just waiting for the tear downs to begin. So I think it's really, in Kenmore, all the neighborhoods are ripe for discussion. The question is really which neighborhoods want to entertain the discussion.
Well, and beyond that, or as a follow-on, where is there infrastructure that can support it? We have a lot of cities that do not have adequate sewer lines or sewer capacity. What about stormwater? That isn't going to be able to be paid for by the developer. It's a bigger issue. And so in cities that are lacking infrastructure, you're not going to see this. So what's it going to take to get a capital project? University Place comes to mind. They'd love to have cottage housing. There's sites everywhere. They have no sewer lines. They have no sewer. So until they fix that, they can't have that. It's just not going to happen. And so Rose Hill in Kirkland was the same way for many years. And we know what's going on in Redmond. How long did that take before the city of Redmond finally extended the sewer line to allow development in a close-in location? So every city has to take real inventory of the infrastructure situation and the real needs.
I mean, we've talked about it before, but I would just add that one piece of infrastructure is transit. And I think, if you can earmark areas that are within transit walksheds for increased density, that's a win-win situation.
I'm really intrigued by the waterfront. We worked on a proposal years ago for a private developer and found that it was the infrastructure, in fact, the transportation infrastructure, trying to figure out that snarl of streets and congestion right down here by the river that really precluded any kind of development there. But untangling that knot and the knot up and down the river would be a really interesting thing to try to do. And I know the city's worked on that, and that might be a good time to try again.
I was going to highlight that, since a lot of our cities were planned around the car, and a lot of there are tons and tons of open spaces that are formal or formerly malls, industrial sites. The nature of our economy is changing, and I think that's probably the same thing in Kenmore, that there are lots of large parcels that we just have driven by and not thought about what the possibilities are. I just look at this town from Google Earth, and I'm like, oh my God, what's that? I mean, that warehouse is right on the water. Like, what could that be if it isn't whatever it is, right? And I think that's something that when I look at the sort of the 10,000-foot view, I'm looking at this, what this sort of city center could be as it expands and sort of takes over those sites that were never meant to be urban, but now are the stage is set.
Any other final thoughts? Well, now I'm going to give you an opportunity to tell the city what you do think they could do to encourage more of this. This is kind of your open opportunity.
George, you're the land planner. Why don't you go first?
Well, I must say I don't know. I mean, I'd have to really take a look at the regulatory regime, but I don't have any off-the-cuff answers. I'd have to really think a little bit more about that. Like I say, I think the waterfront is a we could do better with that damn waterfront, I would think. But, you know, I know there's a lot of constraints as well. I think it's a complicated issue. I mean, that's a tough question because it is so specific to the different areas and almost down to the different sites. But I would look at the regulatory regime first and see if that's working for you. And I would get with other panelists here and ask them, hey, what's wrong with this picture? So they could, and that's what you would do anyway if you were looking at this from a regulatory standpoint or a community development standpoint, is you would convene a group of knowledgeable members of the development community as well as the neighborhoods. Get them together and talk about these kinds of things, and so you get both perspectives in on that. And I think that would be the first thing I would try to do.
Anyone else?
I've got a crazy idea. I don't know. I know very little about Kenmore. I apologize. But when I look at it on a map, I see that we've got a lot of curvy streets. They're very long. They don't connect to blocks. From a walkability standpoint, like if you're 200 yards that way, your walk to this place might be a quarter mile. And so I wonder if there isn't, or maybe there already is, a secondary network of pedestrian trails that basically shortcuts the city streets. Because I look at the people that live on the hill here, and how do they get to the water? And the answer is by car, and that seems like a big opportunity.
Well, and it's community visioning, right? So what do you want to be when you grow up as a town? You know what you are now. What would you dream of? What would you wish to have? What would you like to look like? And then putting the pieces together to move in that direction. Whether it's, a grid street pattern that shortcuts all these curvy streets and a town center, meaningful neighborhood commercial on key corners, specific parcels that could have some dramatic civic building like this, and one then there's over there.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's others. And what are the parts and pieces that are missing as you build a whole new town? And what does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I know less than those who have spoken, but I'll speak anyway. I really like what I see starting to happen here in this center, this town center. I was able to really conveniently take the bus from the UW to right down there. It was almost door to door. Took me about 35 minutes. I was able to do some work while I was on the bus. I went in for the first time to the Kenmore Hangar, a building that I've seen in photographs. It was full of people doing interesting things. I would say build on what you have started here. I'm assuming there's probably going to be more multifamily here, but then what's the next layer out? And I completely agree with Matt's comment that connect the street grid as much as you can. But there is a there here. And I think it's pretty exciting.
So my only last couple comments, I think, given all the great work that Kenmore has done on the town center, so I'll say this, yeah, I know, but just to let everyone know, I wasn't the first choice. There was many developers before me. I was just lucky everyone else said no, or ran out of money. So but the real thing is, here's really interesting, I think. First, high level, when we go to the next, first, use design guidelines, not design review boards.
Yes.
Okay?
Hallelujah.
Number one. Two, try to,
Amen.
if you can, be thoughtful and adopt a zoning code ahead of time that's very thoughtful and flexible, and stress test it. And stress test it not only with the development community, not only with architects, not only with city planners, but also the neighborhood groups. And that's where I think a lot of times there's that lack of dialogue. And be willing to have real conversations. So many times we go to these community visionings and everyone's putting up dots, but no one's saying, no one's really having that tough conversation, say, hey, this is what it means, or what are you willing to trade? That's where, Rick, your comment about what's more important. And, I know, like, again, I'm going to pick on Kirkland, most of the part, so many of our housing was so old, World War II, it wasn't even meant to last 50 years. So it was really, don't save the housing, it's falling apart, tear it down, But in that case, the trees are more important, so that's fine. And then I think, the very last thing that everyone said here, and I would say this is where, again, Kim Moore's done such a great job, is truly engage in the neighborhoods and find out who's willing, and if possible, but get larger, do it in a large swath at one time. Because if you do it too small, all you're going to do is drive up that land prices because there's not enough. And that's the biggest problem we're seeing in so many cities. The cities are so unwilling to be, visionary, like we're seeing up in Vancouver, BC with the Cambria rezone, that scarcity drives up pricing. And that gets back to your point, Rick, about, and on John, is that how do you create more equity? Don't let it be just so beholden, so only so few can be the beneficiary. So that's it.
Great. Well, I know we wanted to carve out just a little bit of time, John, for you to talk about specifically your work in Tacoma. And so I'm going to turn it back to you.
Well, if I could broaden that question a little bit and talk about some of the work that, some of the objectives that Tacoma was, which was basically trying to encourage the missing middle, mostly ADUs and corner lots and those kinds of things, small lot development. It was a very interesting project. Last I looked, they had not received a lot of effort on that. So, but there's a lot of other communities throughout the state. One of the things we did as part of that project was to look at other regulations for the types of infill housing that we have here, and made a great big chart. And I'm happy to get that out to anybody who wants it. And we should be updating it, and look at what the other regulations were on these other municipalities with regard to size, parking requirements, whether owner occupancy was required, all the other kinds of things that affect the affordability and development feasibility of different types of these missing middle projects. So, and what we found, it's somewhat discouraging, and we haven't done this 3 or 4 months ago, I think now. We looked back and called some of the cities that we gleaned their regulations from, and they haven't had a lot of action with some of the infill types of things that they're trying to sponsor. So that says to me that we need to go a little bit further. I really think it's important to advertise the opportunities that you're offering through these different infill types of housing. I think it's important to have some form of assistance so that people, a lot of these are single-family homeowners or that are coming to think about that, or they might have a small, acre or two of property and wondering what they want to do, and they're kind of afraid. Put yourself in their minds. They're not familiar with all the codes, and they don't really want to go spend a lot of money on an architect. No offense, but they want, if they could get a little bit of help at the counter, so that they could say, oh yeah, that might work. I can put 6 units on there. Then they might go talk to an architect and figure out how to do it. So, in my mind, thinking about the kinds of things that might be homeowner or property owner driven, I think we need to kind of somehow do more. We found that certainly in Seattle. I mean, it took a long time. We've been working, Rick's on the Planning Commission now. I was on the Planning Commission at the turn of the century, and we were talking about it back then, how do we get people to do this stuff, and we talked about sample plan books where we would actually have model plans that they could just take off the shelf and go build over their garage or whatever. And it's taken a long time to get that going. Although I will say in my neighborhood, I can't walk a block without seeing something like this, either a tear down and a multiplex put up, or additional units put behind an existing house, or an ADU, or raising the house and putting a unit underneath. So it does happen.
Thank you. Well, this has been a really rich discussion. Thanks to all of you. We did want to allow some time for anyone to ask questions. There's a microphone right up here in the center. If folks just want to come up.
First, I'll say, is this on? First, I'll say I'm from Wallingford, 3625 Meridian. And the north side, those 6 feet, that neighbor mowed it. And then I mowed the 6 feet on the south side. We were a few blocks from Darn Good Grocery. So my question relates to what laws do we need to look at changing in the next 1 to 2 years to have a real effect? So that's where I'm going. Let me show you how I got there. So the zoning and the laws we have now are producing predictable outcomes. So if you have an acre, you'll get 6 houses that are worth $800,000 to $1 million. And they just keep building them because they know they can make money doing that. So our zoning and what the builders are comfortable with keep producing the same result with the land disappearing. So it feels like, my theory is, there should be a density that on that 1 acre, you could build enough small houses that the builder could still make the same amount of money. My goal is for the builders to make money in Kenmore and keep doing more of what we need, which is increase the number of houses. So is there any information anybody has on that? And then kind of that comes from that, what are the laws we would need to change? What are the zoning regulations we would need to change to allow that to actually happen?
I can talk a little bit to that, and then I'll pass it along. But I think what you're talking about is minimum densities. So I don't really give a rip about density, maximum densities, but in a lot of cases I think minimum densities make a lot of sense. Or reducing the amount of building bulk that you can have for an individual single-family house also makes a lot of sense. But then allowing a lot of density. So, for example, in some of our inner city areas, I would set a minimum density of 10 units an acre, at least, or 12 units, because that's what it takes to support a neighborhood center or good transit. So it makes sense, I think, in a lot of ways to do that. You have to be careful, though. It really depends so much on context, the particular neighborhood or city that you're in. And it also, what you can do depends so much on the site, whether or not you've got an alley or a corner lot or enough property that you have some flexibility. So it's a little tricky, but I think minimum density requirements are a good way to do what you're asking for.
Mm-hmm. Great. Oh, I think there was a couple people. Right there. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Thought you were sneaking in.
Look at that.
Okay.
I want to ask a question to Eric, actually, too. A lot of this is talking about housing of the past. There's a place in the past I don't want to get to, and that's when we had ghettos and the right side and the wrong side of the tracks.
Right.
You got awfully close there, though, when you talked about letting the rich people live in downtown Kirkland and putting people at lower economic statuses out in Kingsgate. Kingsgate's not a bad place. It's a
No,
great place.
it's not.
But when you're talking about separating people with different economic statuses, you're talking about breaking up community. And I think a lot of this is about community, and building strong communities means having different people live in desirable places, especially in a downtown area where there's transit options, grocery options, and things like that. So if you could address that
Sure.
a little bit. And then also, you mentioned that a developer has to pay the impact fees. School fees are a lot. If you don't think the developer should do that, where do you think that cost should go?
Right.
Because an educated community, whether you have kids or not, benefits everybody. So where do you think
Sure.
That cost should go?
Yeah, and that's the reason why I brought these, points, so they can get a little controversy, because if we don't talk about it, then we're not going to solve it. So first and foremost, when you put inclusionary housing and you put into a high-end project, when you look and say because Kingsgate is not low-income housing, right? And you're saying, well, who are we trying to target? And if you look at most of the time when we say who's missing out, we're talking about younger starting off families. We have great existing housing stock that we're not preserving. And what's happening, those homes at Kingsgate, they're going to get torn down. And they're going to be $1.5 million homes here really soon. All you have to do is go look at Lake Hills and Bellevue. And so the part here is 1,000 square foot condominium, or you can preserve, other older condos. I mean, there's a part of the thing on inclusionary housing. There's a lot of smart choices to preserve the existing housing stock. So that's not the right or the wrong track. On the part about impact fees, when you're doing infill, like we were talking about, like in Seattle and so on, that house there has been paying property taxes for years. And if you're adding just one more unit, and let's say it's only a one bedroom, not targeted towards families, there is no negative impact on adding stress to that school district. You are actually going to generate more property taxes, which benefit the school district. If you look at the King County property taxes, almost 2/3 of your property tax goes to schools. Take a look at it. It's shocking. Between the state and our local schools. That's just the way it is. And so it's a net benefit to the school district, not a negative, to be waiving those impact fees for those affordable units and for those houses that's not going to be producing children. So, but it's a good discussion. That's the reason why we raise those points. So thank you for your comments.
Hi. Okay. So just what you were saying, if people want more information on that, they can go to the King County website, the Accessory,
Yeah.
look up Localscape, and it'll tell you exactly for your property
Yeah.
what everything goes to. So I had two quick questions. Number one, I think Linda said earlier that in order to keep houses affordable, that you have to have housing supply.
Mm-hmm.
And according to the King County report, we need to be building 24 houses a day, every day for the next 5 years. And then we have to decide what we're going to do when we grow up. So what I want to know then, if the GMA says you have to have a jobs and housing balance,
Right.
how are we going to deal with the fact we are not in jobs and housing balance? We are not in taking the 13 originally and now 14th
Yeah.
plan to be in balance. And there is no political will to move the
Yeah.
GMA line.
That's correct.
So how are you going to help that? Because the problem's not going to go away
Right.
unless we can get every one of the builders in a room and say, how many can you provide for me tomorrow and the
Yeah.
next day and the next day? 'Cause I need 24 every day.
That's right.
So how are we going to do that if we don't have land planned out? That's my first question. Second question is on the density issue with more impervious surfaces. How are we going to have the wastewater capacity? We have 432 million gallons a day in Seattle, and we hit that on a regular basis.
Right.
So the joke is people can come to Seattle, but don't take showers and don't flush the toilet.
Right.
Not going to be happy people.
Right.
So that's the capacity right now that's hitting the ceiling.
That's
So
right.
those are my two questions.
There you go.
Well, I would say we need to make it easier to build, right? It takes, 2 years in permitting and entitlements to have a project approved before you could even start construction. It's just too long. Whether it's a complicated project or not, it's too long. How do we speed that up? How do we remove some of the cost barriers in terms of whether it's impact fees or infrastructure requirements? And I don't mean in a hookup. I'm talking about sewer hookups. I'm talking about water meter hookups, infrastructure cost that are all part of a new project. How do we streamline that? How do we make it more affordable and perhaps more incentive to build? Maybe we should waive some of these permitting fees in certain places where we want growth and we want it right now. And we can always add them later. That's easy enough to do. But what if we waive them for a couple of years to really speed up this process? What if we added more planners? Right now I'm an entitlement in the city of Seattle, and I'm told that there aren't enough people to review the ECA conditional use permit that I have submitted because during the recession we laid off all these people and they haven't hired them back. And so we just don't have enough human beings. Well, how come they haven't hired them back? Seattle City Light, I waited 6 months for power to be hooked up, permanent electric service to 2 homes I built over here in Lake Forest Park. Why? because they laid off a lot of people in the recession. They didn't hire them back because they don't want to have to lay them off again. So they're short of linemen and folks that can actually, run wire and conduit to hook up electricity. There are projects that have sold houses that can't close because there's no electricity there yet. So how do we ramp up the whole support network that helps us build those 24 houses a day that we're not building?
Where are you going to build them? If
Where?
You don't move the
We
GNA.
need-
Where are you going to build
Well,
24 a day?
Go ahead, Matt, you hit first.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at where like growth management boundaries are in other places, there's a hard, bright line between what's developable and what's not. If you look at what's inside the growth management boundary in King County, it's rural. It's not urban. Expanding the growth management boundary, all it's doing is spreading that really, really low density housing further. You talk about like the impact of more pavement, that's the impact of paving a road out to that place. That's not where we should be putting people. We shouldn't be expanding the growth management boundaries. We should be unlocking our single family zoning. Right now we look at all of these cities and we say, yeah, they're full. The zoning says they're full because there's nowhere else to put people. There's nowhere else to build those lots. But I look at the map and say there are places everywhere. These cities are empty, and it's only a matter of having the will and sort of the thinking that we should be not looking at some sort of future horizon where there's free, cheap land somewhere else. It's that there are opportunities here everywhere.
Yeah, it's, I threw out the numbers, which you quickly calculated into 24 a day. If we just take one jurisdiction and one housing type, which is ADUs in Seattle, we've had the ordinance to allow ADUs since 1994. We have 120,000 single-family parcels just in Seattle, one jurisdiction. To date, we've built ADUs on about 2% of them. So if everyone suddenly decided tomorrow to build an ADU, it'll take 2 years, as Linda pointed out. But that one move would actually make a sizable dent in the number of units that the King County Affordable Housing Task Force says that we need. So to Matt's point, we have plenty of places to build housing without expanding our urban growth boundary. I didn't entirely understand the point about the stormwater or sewer infrastructure. I'm not an expert on that, although I do know that we now have mandatory green stormwater infrastructure in Seattle, and it's actually having a very positive impact on our stormwater problem, which is going to continue to get worse because of climate change and significant rainfall events. I do know, and I know nothing about this, but I'm only throwing it out because of one conversation I had with someone pretty high up at Seattle Public Utilities whose job is to kind of envision where we might go. And the cost of replacing our sewer system would be astronomical.
That's the thing.
Not just the cost of replacing it itself, but the impact cost to the city economically in terms of streets being shut down and everything else, that the city is having serious conversations about decentralizing everything. And I don't know exactly what that means, whether it means composting toilets in buildings, which it might, but it's a serious conversation that the city is having because I think they're realizing that the late 19th and early 20th century strategy is probably not going to work in the late 21st century.
So actually, that isn't funny because the Bullitt Foundation actually does have compostable.
No,
toilets.
we know.
Yeah, no, it does it all.
It's
off.
real.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
real.
yeah, it's off. It's completely off the grid.
We actually have the part of there are some real great solutions that right now governments, currently not passed, like one about stormwater. We can, if we are allowed in certain jurisdictions, we can take rain, all the water off our off our roofs, and not put that into the storm sewer. Currently Seattle does. Parts of the east side it doesn't, but the east side, Kathy, we have some huge neighborhoods. Not to pick, I'm not going to pick on Kingsgate, but we also have Lake Hills, huge neighborhoods that have horrible infrastructure with huge lots. And yet the reality is today, most people would be really happy to have only a 3,600 square foot lot. That's the other thing. Times have changed. I mean, people, there's very few people who want to live on a 1 acre lot. That used to be what this region was about. That's not what people want today. And so the tough part is, though, is trying to find those neighborhoods that say, you know what, that's what we want. And the tough part has been, right now, the vocal minority has held that up. And we know, like in Lake Hills, that's been a huge problem.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
The other, if I could add on a comment on the last couple commenters have questioned about, and that is the development impact fees. And it seems to me that we've turned it around and said, oh, we're going to have development impact fees for housing developers, when the real issue is we're allowing employers to come in and add thousands and thousands of people every year to this region. And if you really look at the demand for housing, it's been fueled by the job growth, which is a good thing up to a point. And but we need to also look at that part of the equation. It's not only how many jobs we have, but where we put them. I mean, right now, Seattle's playing hog-em-all with major employers, and we need to spread those out, just as the regional growth strategy calls for. But until we have a better way of distributing the employment, we're going to still have these struggles of places where we have, too hot a market and areas where we're building housing, but people take an hour and a half to get to work. So it's a larger issue, and I'm off topic, so I'll be quiet.
Hello. So you guys are going to regret putting me up on this mic.
Uh-oh.
No, we're ready.
So I have a thing for everyone, a thing for Eric, a thing for Matt, a thing for Linda, and a thing for John.
Oh, boy.
So here's the everyone one. Where can tiny homes, micro apartments, and the like fit into this whole situation? Because tiny homes, especially, as mentioned before, contribute to composting via composting toilets and their plumbing, which is also compostable. And these units are very popular with younger millennials and are projected to continue to rise in favor of popularity by Gen Zers within the next 5 years. So that's pretty dang soon, okay? So there's an example. Kirkland has a beautiful micro apartment complex. You guys might have actually seen it. With mini market and a mini restaurant, but then upstairs they have just enough space for a shower and a bed, and then they have shared kitchen on the same floor, shared entertainment area, same floor. None of that is in unit. All of that is shared on the same level. So I thought that was freaking-tastic when I saw that. But anyway, and I've personally seen it, and I think it's just wonderful. So that's my everyone. Start taking notes. Here we go. So for John, he's the longest one, so we'll start with him. You mentioned redlining and gentrification. Holla, okay? Because I was born and raised in the South, and as a multiracial family, white flight was something we couldn't avoid, okay? For those who don't know what white flight is, simply put, a family of color would move into a predominantly middle-class Euro neighborhood, and then the Euro descent family would move out as soon as those African-American people, or darker, or brown, or whatever, moved in. So this continued until you had a predominantly African-American, brown-dominant community and no one else. So I don't know if that's as big of an issue here in Kenmore or East Seattle, but if it is, how does that hinder the missing middle process in 2019? So I'm going to keep going because I got parking for you too. Parking. A good amount of millennials, especially zennials like me, are looking to have public transit or self-propelled transportation and less automobile because of the climate crisis movement. We don't see this trend changing anytime in the next decade. How can we create middle housing with this in mind? As for parking spaces being given away, now there's a market via app for people to rent out their own private spots. Could that work for rental homes as well as private? So that's you, John. Do you want a minute to answer that? Okay. First, second, or third paragraph.
What's the question again?
Okay, so there's 3. The first paragraph was on your redlining and gentrification. Okay, so skipping to the question part, I don't know if this is as big of an issue here in Kenmore and East Seattle, but if it is, how does that hinder the missing middle process in 2019? See, told you, take notes. That's what I said.
Okay.
Then the third question is, how can we create middle housing with parking in mind, the fact that we're Zennials, Millennials, and future Gen Zs are not looking to have private cars anymore. And using self-propelled transportation, like our own legs and bicycles and public transportation. And the last one was, as for parking spaces being given away, there's an app now for people to rent out their own private parking spaces. So how could that, excuse me, let me try that again. Could that work for rental homes as well as private? Those are your three questions.
Okay, let me start with the number 3 because I can remember it.
Right.
Yes, I've seen it work like in Pike Pine in Seattle, where you can rent out. You don't have to. You can decouple the parking requirement from the house or from the unit. So, for example, somebody could rent it out to another place, or you could, as a landlord, you could say, okay, your unit is so many $1,000s a month, and for an extra $200 a month, you can have a parking stall. So yes, you can decouple that. With regard to the transportation choices that we're seeing now, I think it's a perfect reason to reduce parking requirements, and I would really recommend you take a look at the Metro right-size parking, which kind of takes that into account. Okay. And you can even lower that. I can see a municipal saying, okay, generally we're going to take a 25% reduction of parking from that particular metric that they come out with in this pretty sophisticated analysis. With regard to redlining and gentrification, I think that, God, I'd hope that we don't redline anymore. I don't see any evidence of that. My old neighborhood, I would live a block away from an old red line. And you can kind of see the difference in the housing types that were built during that time. I mean, it's kind of
across the street.
And right now the zoning is different right along that red line. But as I see people of color on my side of the line and people of non-color on the opposite side, I think we're kind of getting past that formal aspect of it. Now, the social and equitable issues are still paramount. I mean, if you look at people of color, their equity in homes is almost nothing, almost nothing.
Of color, by the way.
Huh?
I know that.
Yeah. So okay. So that to me is the biggest thing. We have the great disparity in home equity that we see. So one of the things I would like to see happening through all this affordable housing is some way of raising the equity, people's of lower incomes equity through this. And I don't know how. It might be subsidized loans. It might be an FHA program that does a better job of leveling off the playing field or something. But it's a tough issue. Now, gentrification, now that's something that really is front and center right now, because the growth has been so fast that neighborhoods are turning over so quickly, and what you get is displacement, which is really the evil twin of gentrification. So gentrification can happen over time. So it's really about the rate of change. If a neighborhood changes over 40 years, well, that's about an adult life cycle. So that's not too bad. But right now it's changing in a matter of 2 or 3 years, and that's really unpleasant. So to me, again, I think you have to be much more careful about the employment levels and the number of people going in. One other thing, if I could beat this up, is you're a zillennial. Zennial. Excuse me.
I'm an elder millennial.
So so someday, I'm guessing, I don't know for sure. Well, I won't make it personal, but younger people grow up and they have kids. So
I have a 15-year-old.
Yeah. So to me, I think one of the things we shouldn't forget about. I mean, right now people are going, over tea kettle to build for the younger, high-paying techies that are moving in, but they're going to be wanting places to raise families. So while I think that the examples you have for apartments and those kinds of things are great, I think we don't want to forget families. And that's one of the things I think is Seattle in particular is losing out, is becoming a place where
I'm going to get to that.
kids are just not welcome.
Could-
So, you know, I guess that's my
We're on
comment.
time,
It's-
and they're trying to roll me out.
I am actually going to politely interrupt, if I just may. We did say that this was going to end at 9, and I really want to respect the panelists' time. They've given us a lot of time this evening, and I know that there may be other audience members that have questions, so I just want to kind of be respectful to the panelists. If they, to how much time we have. More, we've already gone 20 minutes over our allotted time frame here. So
I promise this won't take more than 5.
I would, if you could keep it to 5 minutes, that would be
I
greatly
promise
appreciated.
On my grandmother's grave, this is not going to take that long. Okay, so thank you for answering that. For Linda, how to turn historic strip malls, deep shade, by the way, I like that one, into not only equitable but also profitable and livable. Is it just like a zoning issue?
Well, it is a zoning. I mean, it's a commercial zone, right? And so residential housing typically is prohibited.
Okay,
So
it's
again,
just a zoning issue.
it's what's allowed by law, and the law is the zoning code.
That's fair.
Single family, commercial, multifamily, do away with that, anything could happen.
Eric, you're next. You mentioned sidewalks and what neighborhood is wanting it, and I just want to let you know, try 185th, right there behind us, okay, between 68th and 70th Lane Northeast. BT Dubs, that's where I live. And I walk that daily, and let me tell you, they put these little bumpers on the side next to the trailer neighborhoods, and that's great and all, but when people is tipsy, they don't see them. So if we could have a sidewalk, that would be great. That's a quick one for you, Eric.
Good, thanks.
That's it. So I'm letting you know. That's what neighborhood right there. Go do the walk. They will tell you. The next one is Matt, which is a bit longer, but not nearly as long as John, I swear to goddess. Linda, no, Matt, excuse me, I said that wrong. Making side hustles part of a neighborhood. So I'm an interior decorator, and right now we're facing the beginning of a second recession. So luxury independent business owners like myself are suffering a bit because people aren't buying services as much because, recession. So in this modern age, it's more accessible and affordable to have and do everything online, especially if you consider the cost of renting a business space. This right now lends to a lot of restaurant spending for places to meet clients because, let's face it, no one wants to meet me for a consultation in my second floor townhouse down a back alley road. Not a good look. So businesses like mine don't need much space to operate, but it does need to fit the overall business model and image. I'm also in the low income bracket. How would we build for someone like me? I'm looking at you because you were looking at me. That's how that works.
Okay. One quick thing.
Yeah.
Is, I will say this, the hangar has been a great job.
Validate that.
At City of Kenmore, I mean, just in all sincerity, I mean, Rick, you saw it today. I am shocked how well that's become a community asset. And
You work there.
and that's what I was going to say. For that point, City of Kenmore has stepped up, and it's exceeded, I think, even everyone's expectations. So hopefully more people learn from Kenmore.
I think that for a lot of people, having just having a room with a door that's accessible from the outside, that independent entrance, like that in itself could be enough to be able to pull off that side hustle. But for the most part, we don't necessarily allow that, or there's lots of regulations. So I think that it's just a matter of not making not putting up barriers to that. Like if you look at the building code, right? If you have to separate a commercial use from a residential use, and that in itself is thousands of dollars, like drywall and fire rating and all this kind of stuff. And I think that the more we can kind of use the zoning code to say, yeah, but these sorts of things at this scale are not changes of use. They're not. They don't require separate building permits. They don't require all the barriers that you might include if you're trying to, do something for, separating something hazardous, some hazardous use from residential. And I think that the more we can do that, then there's more opportunities. And it may not be in your townhouse, right? But it might be in your neighbor's townhouse, or the house down the street. I think it's a matter of like basically empowering kind of the environment that we have, the urban environment, to like create those places for entrepreneurs.
Yeah. So
Great. So
that
I am
gives
going to
it
cut it off at this point. And we want to thank all of our panelists who spent an entire evening with us.
That's me. Look forward.
And thank you to Lindsay as well for moderating.
I think I might.
And just to
yeah,
let
I would like
everybody
to
know,
talk to you about
tonight's
it.
event was recorded, and we will post this on the
Yeah.
website, so it will be available to kind of go back and review. But again,
And
thank you
it's
to the
a
panelists.
great little 1926 wood